Hello, and welcome to Cognitum, a show dedicated to exploring the present and future of science and technology. I'm your host, Iosif Gershteyn. Today we have in the studio Dr. Andrey Vyshedskiy, Professor of Neuroscience at Boston University, theorist, and entrepreneur. We are here to discuss the core ideas in his wonderful book, The Origin of the Human Mind, and their implications. Hello, Andrey.
Hello, Iosif. How are you?
Very well. So, could you start by, again, telling us what is mental synthesis?
Right. Mental synthesis is that special type of imagination that allows you to purposefully, consciously imagine novel objects in your mind. We gave this process a special name, mental synthesis, to distinguish this process from other types of imagination. Imagination that you experience in a vivid, bizarre dream. That imagination is spontaneous, driven by spontaneously firing neuronal ensembles. The imagination that we are talking about, mental synthesis, is the imagination that is driven by the left lateral prefrontal cortex. This is purposeful imagination, conscious imagination, and the imagination that is probably unique to human beings.
What caused humans to develop this special function?
Right. The answer I'm going to give you is a speculative answer. Most likely, the reason we acquired this new faculty of the mind is the synergistic combination of articulate speech and enhanced visual processing. Articulate speech was developing a long time before Homo sapiens. We know that in Homo erectus, that evolved over 2 million years ago, we see first elements of evolving speech apparatus. And we're almost sure that by 600,000 years ago, Homo erectus acquired articulate speech to the level, or almost to the level of modern humans. So Neanderthals were definitely speaking, and they probably spoke as much as us. They had a communication system. Scientists are not sure whether we call this communication system language, because it was probably a simple communication system that consisted of many words, but probably it was a finite communication system. Every word was communicating a certain concept, certain image.
But how is that different from the concept of language?
Right. In modern humans, language is infinite. I can communicate infinite number of images to you. Let me give you an example. Let's have a communication system that consists of 1,000 nouns and nothing else. So in that communication system, I communicate to you 1,000 images. So 1,000 nouns, 1,000 images. We have a noun for the book, for the table, for the chair, and that's all I can communicate. Let us now introduce spatial prepositions. If you introduce just one spatial preposition, you can now communicate 1,000 multiplied by 1,000 images, because you can say the book on the table on the book. If you introduce two spatial prepositions, you can say the book is on the table is under the table. So the number of images is even greater. Two spatial prepositions allows you to communicate 1 million images, and 3 spatial prepositions allow you to communicate 1 billion images, and so on and on. the number of images we can communicate in our communication system is far greater than the number of atoms in the whole universe. It's really, truly infinite language. And it is unlikely that Neanderthals had this infinite language.
Mm-hmm. So the difference between a communication system and a language is the ability to put words together instead of just sign at specific objects.
That's one of the differences. The biggest difference is that the infinite language relies on the mental synthesis to create novel images in the mind. I'm using your mental synthesis ability to create any number of novel images in your mind. I can describe an object that you have never seen. I can describe you a creature with 3 heads and the body of a horse. And now you have in your mind a creature with 3 heads and the body of the horse. You can draw it, and your drawing would be very simple, very similar to my drawing of this creature. So I was able to communicate you a novel image with just a limited number of words. And this is the property of the modern infinite syntactic language. We can communicate infinite number of images to other people. And of course, it opens up all kinds of possibilities, right? Infinite language allows me to create a plan and to explain it to other individuals in a tribe. I can think of a new strategies of attacking animals. For example, do you know how Neanderthals were hunting? How would you hunt? How would you hunt a big animal? Both Neanderthals and humans were hunting big animals like mammoths. How would you hunt a mammoth?
I would recruit your assistance. I would. What did people do?
Well, the simplest plan that Neanderthals were using is just to come with as many people as possible and puncture the mammoth simultaneously. Then the mammoth will start bleeding, and as the mammoth bleeds, it becomes weaker, and then has high probability of dying. But it's a very complex way of attacking the mammoth. The mammoth will kick you and kill a lot of you and will break a lot of bones. And what we see now when we dig out Neanderthal bones, we see a lot of broken bones that healed. And this tells us much more than early humans. And this tells us that they had this very different type of attack. They would basically run all together and try to puncture that mammoth. Humans attacked very differently. We would build a trap. We would trap a mammoth. The mammoth would fall into a pit, and then we can come later on, a couple of days later, when the mammoth is weak, and just puncture the mammoth and cut pieces and have whole dinner. So creating a plan, creating a simulation in the mind, this is what mental synthesis is great, right? You can play different scenarios in the mind and select the best.
What is the evidence that humans are the only animal capable of this sort of?
Right. Well, once you acquire mental synthesis, there's whole set of manifestations, external. Mental synthesis is a subjective process, right? But it has a number of external manifestations that you can observe in species and deduce whether that species acquired mental synthesis or not. So one of the manifestations, of course, the infinite syntactic language. We can discuss any number of concepts. I can explain to you any number of novel images. I can explain you the new creatures. I can explain you the how the football match went between two teams. I can explain to you the construction of a trap. I can explain the simulation of the future attack. So that's one way. Another is drawing. We draw novel object. For example, I put this creature on the cover of the book, and this is half lion, half human. This lion man was created by carving of a bone over 30,000 years ago by early humans. And this is clear indication that by that time we modern humans acquired mental synthesis, because we imagine something new. We imagine we had the lion in our memory, we had a body of a human in our memory, but we synthesize a new object. Another manifestation of mental synthesis is religion. We invent the God. We invent something that we imagine. We invent that the God requires us to bury people with things they could use in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. So, for example, people were burying other people for, at least we find the remains of Homo erectus that were buried 1 or 2 million years ago. But we don't find burials that are elaborate. We don't find any things that people could use in the afterlife. And then as soon as we acquired mental synthesis, by 40,000 years ago, we start seeing burials where humans are buried in full tunic with a lot of art objects on them, with all kinds of mammoth tooths hanging on them, things that they could use in the afterlife. So
there is some anthropological evidence indicating in favor of this theory that we didn't have it at some point, and then we did, and that caused a lot of these concepts that we see reflected in a different burial ceremony.
That's right. Anthropological evidence comes from 4 different lines. The first are these artworks, absolutely fascinating artworks that you find on the cave walls, and these statues like Lion Man. The second line of evidence is elaborate burials. The third line of evidence is construction of dwellings. And the fourth line of evidence is all kinds of new tools.
Well, with the construction of dwellings, we know that certain animals also create dwellings for themselves. Right. So why is that a line of evidence anthropologically for mental synthesis, unless birds have mental synthesis, which clearly they can't?
Right. It's the dwellings that humans create. Well, look around you. All the houses we have, they're all different. They show our ability to plan, to simulate, to imagine this plan, and then build the house. And if you look at the nests created by birds, they all look very similar. And the same thing for the nests created by ants and the termites, and they're all very similar, unlike our human, really imaginative way to build our houses.
What about the birds that create beautiful patterns to attract mates? And those have a diverse range of patterns. Wouldn't that be contrary to your theory?
Right. Once species acquire mental synthesis, they really exhibit the whole range of manifestations. It's not just the dwellings. It's many other things like religion, like all kinds of new tools, the bow and arrow, the projectile spears, the spear throwers. These are these things that you use to throw a spear much farther with more force. Ceramics was invented around 30,000 years ago, around the same time as other tools. So it's a whole complex that we have to consider.
So any individual manifestation is not enough, but when taken together, the totality of evidence indicates towards the uniqueness of mental synthesis in humans.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So when, historically speaking, do you think this occurred in humans? How did this benefit them? And what are some of its implications?
Right. Most likely, the acquisition of mental synthesis and full infinite syntactic language occurred before humans spread out of Africa and occupied the whole planet. Since we know the date when humans left Africa, it happened around 70,000 years ago, because we know that humans reached Australia and the islands by about 60,000 years ago. So the acquisition of mental synthesis had to happen before 70,000 years ago. Give or take another 10,000 years, so the acquisition, the cognitive revolution that enabled humans to acquire the mental synthesis and syntactic language probably occurred around 100,000 years ago in Africa. Probably it started with one tribe. I call this theory Romulus and Remus theory because just like the legendary Romulus and Remus who started Rome, parents of Romulus and Remus have animal-like communication system. It's a finite communication system that consists of many words, but it's a finite communication system. They don't have mental synthesis. They are unable to communicate any number of novel images. But Romulus and Remus, they invent a few spatial prepositions, and therefore they enable themselves to acquire mental synthesis and full language. These are the first really, truly modern humans, and they go on to win over the whole humanity, and we are all ancestors. We are all descendants of, at least cultural descendants of these people, these brothers.
What does your theory mean to us as modern humans living in modern society?
Right. Well, first and foremost, mental synthesis is important for our understanding of both neurology of the brain, understanding of evolution of humankind, but in terms of some real use of the theory today, it's probably the education of children. If you take a child and put a child in front of TV for the next 12 years until the child reaches puberty, that child is not going to acquire mental synthesis and therefore going to have lifelong disability of not being able to understand spatial prepositions and understand normal full language. Well, we don't put children in front of TV, but there is a group of children that have this particular problem of not acquiring language normally. These are untypical children. They usually call this group of children with autism. And 70% of children with autism have a problem with language. They don't acquire language as typical children do. And therefore, these children do not acquire mental synthesis. But while learning words can be done throughout life, acquiring mental synthesis have very sharp critical period.
A critical period. So there's a limited amount of time when somebody can acquire this faculty, this cognitive trait.
That's right.
This ability.
That's right.
Critical and if you don't get it in that time, there's no chance of making up for it later.
That's right. Critical period is very common in nature. For example, filial imprinting is the most common example of critical period. When birds are born, they remember their mother as the first object that moves. So the first object that moves, that's their mother. And the critical period is usually a few hours after birth. Well, humans also have all kinds of critical period. The most famous in humans is acquisition of second language. If you don't acquire second language before puberty, you're probably going to have an accent. It's very difficult to get rid of the accent, as you can see from my speech. Well, mental synthesis also have critical period, and it's quite short. If a child is not using full syntactic language until 7, 8 years of age, the child may never acquire mental synthesis and therefore have this lifelong disability. So one of the things we attempt to do in Imagination, the company that I have started, is to develop technology that could help children to acquire language.
The problem with autism is that they develop language more slowly, and because they develop it more slowly, they miss the critical period for mental synthesis, which is requisite for high cognitive function.
That's right. That's right. 30 to 40% of children with autism never acquire mental synthesis. They remain what we call low functioning children. And unfortunately, this is a lifelong disability. So the idea is, and as a society, we understand that. We have language therapy, we have ABA therapy, applied behavioral therapy, for these children that tries to convince these children to use language. And we are trying to develop some technology at Imagination that could facilitate this use of language in these children. The product I'm talking about is called Mental Imagery Therapy in Autism, abbreviated MITA, M-I-T-A. And this is a set of puzzles, brain teasers, on the iPad that parents can use to find a back door to language development. Most of the puzzles are visual and therefore easy for children. Some of the puzzles are verbal as well. Children have to, for example, verbal puzzles work like that. Children have to put the cup on the table, under the table, behind the table, and they have all kinds of prizes for correct solution. We have over 100,000 users of these. Parents were very enthusiastic in accepting this technology, and parents are working themselves, helping children in this very long process of acquiring language.
So this is a way to reduce the chances of low functioning in autism
That's
cases,
exactly right.
because you are able to avoid the initial barrier of language while practicing that mental synthesis skill, in the hopes that when the language catches up, they don't miss the critical period to acquire the cognitive skill, which, if not acquired, will virtually guarantee low functioning autism for the rest of their lives.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Words can be acquired throughout one's life. You can go to Germany and learn German words, but your mental synthesis stays the same. Your ability to imagine novel objects stay the same. And this is what has critical period, not the ability to learn words.
Do you think currently the technology that we have is hurting children's development of their mental synthesis apparatus?
Well, if you put a child in front of TV and give a child YouTube videos to watch and don't do anything else, those things do not help children acquire mental synthesis. And they're actually taking time away from internal cognitive effort of imagining new object that the child could do in that time, and therefore it is detrimental to a child. On the other hand, all kinds of cognitive exercises that kids could be introduced on a iPad have some benefits, because children can solve those puzzles and enhance their mental synthesis. So as everything, you have some pluses and some minuses.
Mm-hmm. So the key, even though in these television shows and YouTube videos there may be a lot of vocabulary that's being used and words that are being heard, because it's not active, the children are not being developed. And the time it takes away from that potential development is the main detriment. It's not necessarily the TV or the YouTube itself that's the problem, it's the time lost.
That's right. Again, we are talking about very small children, probably 2-3 years of age. Later on, children are definitely benefiting from all kinds of information they can acquire through Wikipedia and YouTube. My 13-year-old son knows much more than I do from watching all the kinds of YouTube videos. So it definitely has some benefits, but for very young children, you really has to be very careful. You have to be really careful in limiting children.
Until what age, roughly?
Well, definitely until 4. You want to limit children to, well, ideally, for typical children, you don't even want to introduce the technology. But if you have to, you want to choose and pick the cognitive, the brain teasers, cognitive puzzles, then children can actually use to enhance their imagination, rather than just feeding children movies.
Passive entertainment versus active effort.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much. Very, very inspiring work. I hope that it will help drive your mission and we can decrease the rates of autism and hopefully eradicate low-functioning autism. Thank you so much for your time,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Vyshedskiy.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us tonight with Dr. Vyshedskiy. It's a continuous wonder to see the fruits of human ingenuity benefiting society and the individual. We hope you join us again next time.